Hi there, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Nick.
Hello? Okay, cool. Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to present to you today. So I'm hoping I can distract you for a little longer before the pull of the bar becomes unbearable. So I hope there's something new for you, for all of you here today. But I guess some of this will be standard stuff to many of you. And if you're there, good day, Brett. So the subject that I'm presenting today is growing techniques to improve productivity and spread the season of production. So the sections will be improving productivity, so trying to get more for less, improving water efficiency, so efficient scheduling, drain monitoring and sensors, and then looking at improving fertilizer efficiency, improved EC management and an analytical response. And then a little bit about looking at optimizing harvest efficiency, plant density, and a few thoughts about canopy management. And then in section 2, I just want to look at spreading the season of production and using growing degree hours to help us do that. So we'll look at the concept of growing degree hours, and then we'll have a look at raspberry harvest continuity with successional planting of long canes, adjusting raspberry harvest profile with plant type, adjusting everbearer harvest profile with plant type, and then finally adjusting everbearer harvest profile with plant manipulation, and possibly, if I get fit rapidly enough, maybe a little time for questions. But let's get straight in. The growing techniques to improve productivity or getting more for less. So irrigation, monitoring and control. And the aim is to keep the substrate moist during the day, spreading out irrigation to meet the evapotranspiration demand of your crop. And the options that we have are, for example, time starts, which would be a relatively low-tech option. It needs good knowledge of evapotranspiration demand at different growth stages. And it can require frequent alteration to timer schedule to cope with changes in weather. And it's possibly the least accurate and most labor-intensive, especially in changeable weather. Then we can look at weather stations. These are, we might call medium tech option, using accumulated solar radiation to trigger irrigation cycles, quite usually in joules per square centimeter, where we set a trigger level and the irrigation starts at that level, sets back to zero, accumulates more light, and then triggers again. And so there's a direct relationship between light and the number of irrigations. So there's a close correlation between solar radiation and irrigation demand in unheated crops. It's not quite so straightforward in heated crops. RAD-sum irrigation doesn't really take into account wind or initial substrate moisture, although more complex irrigation controllers now, you're able to add in VPD or relative humidity alterations to your RAD-sum. And then root zone sensors, which we might call a high-tech option. So either measuring soil moisture volumetric content with TDR or capacitance sensors, or measuring soil moisture tension with a microtensiometer. And ideally, you need 3 to 5 of these to whole block or site, which can work out quite expensive, particularly with tensiometers. With volumetric moisture content, it is important to do an initial calibration to find the full point, so that when you're looking at your moisture graph, you can relate that to your substrate in your field and know what the full point is when drain occurs. And then possibly a medium high-tech option is weighing the crop. An area of crop or a part of a row is set up on a weigh scale and irrigated according to weight change or water uptake. These are quite expensive. They're suited to hanging crops, perhaps less suited to ground level support crops. And setup is often very sensitive
Excuse
to
me,
wind,
Nick.
rock and disturbance in a field situation.
G'day, Nick. Sorry to interrupt really quickly. I think you might be presenting a static view of your slides and you're actually moving through them. Our view at this end is only of the title, your first slide. I'm not sure if you can select another window to share, and that might give us a view of what you're moving through.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure why that's happening. Okay, I will. Let's. I don't want to stop sharing because that could.
That's better.
Okay, right. You've got. Okay.
We're with you now.
Right. Okay. Well, so that was the about different irrigation scheduling systems. Which I had just finished. So the bottom number 4 was weighing of the crop with weigh stations, and then at the bottom there, just due to inherent variability within the field, we would suggest, or I would advise, setting up some fixed runoff stations in the field, and these can be either automated or manually checked every day, and additionally, generally would advise daily roving assessment with a handheld wet sensor, or squeeze tests, going along, cutting out a bit of substrate, squeezing it, and getting a sense of the moisture content from a squeeze. Easy squeeze, medium, hard, and very hard squeeze, then you have a feel for the moisture content. So looking at drain stations, so efficient monitoring in substrate grown crops. Drain monitoring is necessary in substrate, and the reason for that is just to make sure that we have uniformity of pot moisture content, tension, and EC. And drain collection must be representative of the whole crop. So we would suggest that the drain station is at a similar level to the crop. Raised containers, significantly raised containers, tend to have a higher water demand due to airflow over the plants. And this can lead to overwatering if you base your irrigation on the information from those plants which are using more water because they're raised up. It usually needs, well, it's best done with several containers, 3 to 6, not just 1 or 2, because a larger sample gives a better drain average. And ideally set up one drain collection point per valve, even if you don't use it every day. Collect the drip from 2 drippers to get a better average than 1, and sometimes 1 dripper starts to clog up. Use a light excluding opaque vessel with a lid, and this minimizes evaporation from the bottle and any algal growth, and therefore you get a stable EC pH volume. And also I would advise you regularly clean those. Many times I've seen them very green, and they're often not giving reliable information. Clean drain stations are by far the most accurate. Runoff or drain would be calculated, well, I would say 1 time a day, but in the summer and in the peak radiation periods, 2 times a day. First time before the first irrigation of the day, which is the driest point in the diurnal irrigation cycle, and then midday or early afternoon during peak water demand. And this just allows you to make timely corrections to your irrigations to be sure to give the best supply evapotranspiration demand, because that's what this is measuring. Obviously, the best option would be an automated drain station. And here's an example of one, recording electronic sensor data. Soil sensors, EDR, WET 150, or the WET sensor. And there is also the FDR Teros 12, or you can use capacitance sensors. such as the Centec drill and drop. And there are micro-tensiometers, Telgil and the Teros 13. The Teros 13 does need barometric pressure compensation, but is an extremely accurate piece of equipment. And we measure suction, not moisture content, which arguably is a better measure of the plant's experience, because it gives us an impression of how hard the plant has to work to take up that water. And other sensors in this station would be a water meter to measure the water being applied, a drip spoon measuring the volume coming out of the station, EC and pH probes, EC in the substrate, and pH and EC in the drip and drain. A solarimeter is good because then we have a feeling for the radiation that those plants are experiencing. And then temperature and humidity sensors to give us information on VPD and the climatic experience for those plants. And these systems can all be joined together to give you a server-based or a cloud-based server with a desktop and a dashboard where you can see your crop and look at the effect of your irrigations on moisture content. This is one, Soil Moisture Sense, but there are a number of others out there, all doing a very good job, all with similar equipment. And this makes controlling your irrigation much easier than with the manual stations. Here's an example of timer-based irrigation, 2 different days. One day, the normal summer's day, 27 degrees, 51 relative humidity, VPD 1.8 and 2,100 joules, so a bright day. In this situation, cycles are 4 minutes, and there's 1 per hour. And on the first day, 10 cycles were applied between 6 a.m. and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and 25% drain. And you can see first irrigation cycle, no drain, which is good. And then there was drain across the day. So we can say here that we did a good job of meeting the ET demand of this crop. Then on a hot day, 36 degrees, relative humidity much lower, 25, 26, VPD 4.5, very stressful, 2,700 joules. On this day, again, 4 minutes, 1 per hour, 16 cycles were applied between 5 in the morning and 10 o'clock. But you can see here that although irrigation, there was good drain in the morning, during the afternoon, during the highest period of radiation, there was no drain. And in this point, we're not meeting the evapotranspiration demand of the crop. So effectively, the substrate is drying out. Now, this was recognized, and at the end of the day, extra irrigation given, which gave drain. But if this happens every day, it ends up wet, which is why we had drain in the morning. So these are the inherent problems of working off timer-based irrigation. Another thing that we really should consider is BC adjustment in high light. The plants grown under high light intensities have a greatly increased water demand, especially when compared to the same plant in lower light intensity. What we know is that the nutrient demand are broadly similar between a bright day and a low light day. So there'll be many more irrigations, so they get much more fertilizer. So unless the EC of the solution is significantly lowered at a higher light intensity, the crop will effectively be overfed, leading to EC accumulation in the substrate. And that can cause a sharp rise in poor water EC and drain EC. So on a hot summer's day, around about 70% of the total ET demand occurs between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. And that corresponds with peak radiation and in the afternoon irradiation as well, and air temperature and VPD. So during these hours, it's important to reduce the drip EC, and this can be correlated with solar radiation. And you can use either your in-field solarimeter if you have one, and many rigs are capable, and we certainly see it, glasshouse and intensive tunnel sites where rigs have a watts per square meter modulation on the dosing channel, so the EC can be reduced on watts. You can estimate your hourly radiation between 10 and 5 p.m. using agromet data for your area, such as WeatherSpark or other sites. And then you can make a manual adjustment of your EC according to the predicted solar radiation. And you can create a chart like we've got here, where we have moderate, bright, very bright, or extreme, with the associated kilowatt hours per square meter. And so on a moderate day, we would potentially say, don't reduce BC. On a bright day, potentially a 0.25 or 0.3 millisiemens reduction in EC. On a very bright day, 0.5 millisiemens reduction. And on an extreme day, you might even reduce by 0.65. Now, in this example, we've assumed that the raw water EC is 0.55. And I would advise not to go lower than 0.6 EC above your raw water, because if you go below that, there's a risk that you are not getting sufficient nutrition or in micro and macro elements because of the existing raw water analysis. So in this example, 0.6 EC above the raw water would give a minimum EC of 1.15. So in this way, you can reduce. If you have short runs, then it's quite easy to reduce the EC during the middle of the day. However, if your pipe runs are much bigger and you have a much bigger water infrastructure, then you have to make EC adjustments over a number of days, because there's no way that you can give a lower EC in the middle of the day than in the morning and afternoon. Okay, so looking at analysis, it's important to get regular analysis, particularly of the drip and drain, and ideally fortnightly, but every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and at important growth stages. And we can use this information to gain some valuable insights about your crop. And this is a document that we use, an Excel spreadsheet that we use to interpret the data. We can look at drip composition, so checking against target values for EC, pH, and all the nutrients. So we can look to see, does it compare well to the recipe? That's good to see, because we soon see if mixing problems have occurred or different elements are being used that we weren't aware of. We can look at drain composition and check that that's where we would expect, and see what's happening inside the bag or the substrate. EC sum, the sum of the drip and the drain. And the reason that's good is because we would tend to have different sum targets for different growth stages, different raw water qualities. And if you are beginning to exceed the sum, then we know that if you drop the drip EC, the sum goes down, or vice versa. If the plants are taking up a lot of nutrition and the sum is falling, then you can increase the drip EC to stay on target. We can compare the drip versus the drain and see what is accumulating and what is depleting. So this gives us a good idea of what the plants are using and what they're not using, and therefore helps us to adjust recipes. We can look at the EC breakdown and see what ions are making up the EC. And finally, look at the accuracy of the lab results. So by looking at the reported milligrams per liter or moles or micromoles, we can then check that electrically in milliequivalent and see if actually the analysis given balances and whether we have an accurate result from the laboratory. And quite often they're not accurate. So then once we have this, accurate fertilizer adjustments can then be made to suit what's happening in the substrate and to your crop. So now looking at density and crop management. So moving from 8-row to 6-row tabletops. So on an Excel spreadsheet, an 8-row tabletop growing system seems very attractive. You have an increased plant population per hectare, 76,000 plants per hectare at 8 plants per meter, versus 57,000 plants per hectare in single rows at 8 per meter. So this gives a potentially higher yield per hectare, better land use efficiency. And that was the situation with growers in Europe, South Africa, Australia, around the world. And this system was taken up widely. But now in Northwest Europe, certainly virtually all growers have converted back to a 6-row single row system. So 6 single rows in an 8.4 meter tunnel. And this was because higher productivity was rarely achieved. Harvest costs were generally higher, waste was always higher, and fruit quality issues were considerably more prevalent. And the reason for this was due to the merged canopy and the double rows. Many berries were hidden in a humid microclimate, and this made picking, spraying, and plant husbandry operations significantly less efficient, including leaf management, where we're removing leaf to maintain canopy efficiency and exposure of fruit. All of these things are more difficult on a double row system. And we can look at a similar idea in raspberries, so the effect of lateral density on yield, fruit quality and pick speed. So this was Floricane Kwanzaa, a PC fruit in Belgium. So they had cold stored dormant long canes of Kwanzaa were planted in tunnels in late winter to give a spring crop May to July. Each 7-litre pot contained 2 dormant long canes, and the rows were 2.6 meters apart. And we had 2 pot spacing, 1.3 pots a meter and 1.95 pots a meter, and that gave 45 to 65 laterals a meter and 75 to 85 laterals per meter. And then we have a table here showing the results. So increasing lateral density gave a higher overall yield. Fruit size and picking speed declined, and class 1 percentage decreased with increasing lateral density. And where fruit quality is an issue, then a lower plant lateral density gives fruit fewer problems. With higher yielding genetics, what we see is overall yield still is pretty reasonable at lower densities combined with better quality and faster picking speeds. The reality is for each genotype has its own sweet spot for optimal yield, pick speed and fruit quality. But in this situation, a lateral density of 55 to 65 gave the best balance of yield, pick speed, and fruit quality. Okay, so now moving to section spreading of the season using growing degree hours. Okay, so the concept of growing degree hours. Growing degree hours are a useful method of calculating thermal growing time. GDHs should be calculated from hourly temperature readings, but they can be expressed over daily, weekly, or monthly or whole crop time period. My preferred is daily. Assumptions with GDHs, below 4.5, little or no growth occurs. Between 4.5 and the optimal temperature, we think there's a linear increase in growth. Above the optimal temperature, it's likely that plant stress is kicking in, and then we have respiration losses and other physiological pressures on the plants, and this distorts the linear relationship between growth and temperature. So between 4.5 and the optimal temperature, growth is tracked by calculating accumulated growing degree hours. The optimal temperature for linear growth is probably genotype dependent. And for example, in many primocane varieties, it looks to be around about 30 degrees C, assuming that there aren't other limiting climate conditions. Calculating GDHs, So it's the average temperature minus 4.5 times the number of hours at that temperature. So an average 24-hour temperature of 20 degrees C would be 20 minus 4.5 times 24, and that would give you 372 GD8 in a day. It's important to be aware that non-linear growth can occur in stressful conditions, for example, due to moisture stress, VPD, or wind. When light is limiting for growth, especially for fruit ripening, as UV is needed for color change. And so in very low light levels, you can have a GDH prediction on harvest, but it doesn't go quite as you would expect because of low UV. Okay, so looking at continuity of production, this is long cane raspberry production in Holland. By using a sequence of successional plantings between January and late July, virtual continuity of production can theoretically be achieved with successive batches of long canes planted approximately 7,000 GDH apart, giving you about 3 weeks separation in the summer. So this is a production schedule for plantings under initially heated glass, and then in tunnels. And the glass at the beginning and the end of the season, and then filled in by plantings through the middle. And the amalgamated production schedule shows a pretty good distribution of harvests across the year. The disadvantages of this, it's highly intensive. A lot of long canes are required. You need a big area for propagation, and you need a lot of cold storage. Labor and transport required for packing and planting and removal, and you need to do the same thing every year. It's really a product handling exercise and requires good roadways, vehicles for getting up and down rows, but can be an extremely efficient and highly automated system. Using GDH profiles to manage production across the year. So cold stored floricanes tend to harvest between 20 and 22,000 GDH from pull out, and they finish around about 36 to 38,000 GDH from pull out. And primer cane harvest, well, it's very genotype dependent, but approximately 36,000 to 38,000 from planting, and finish around about 60,000 GDH from planting. And so we can look at the accumulated yield on florines and primer canes and the associated GD8 along the bottom. And continuity of production could be achieved by a grow through from a July planting. This is in Australia. Remove spawn, about 5 to 8,000 GDH. And to do this, you would need 75,000 GDH or more growing season, and that would require almost certainly tunnel doors and well-sealed sides to achieve that length season. There is the likelihood that the floricane yield will be slightly reduced, and the primer cane yield because of density. The floricane because the primer canes are growing up through it, and the primer cane because it was growing up through the floricane. To maximize per cane yield, you could use 3 separate plantings in 3 different blocks. 2 winter, spring long cane pullouts planted 7,000 GDH apart. So a 3-week harvest gap between the 2 plantings. And then coupled with a primer cane production planted as early as possible in the spring. And in that way, as your second long cane pullout finishes, your primer cane harvest will begin. Adjusting yield profiles with everbearers with different plant types. So in this situation, we have 2 different plant types: a small tree plant, 1 to 2 crowns, planted in late January. This is in Europe, and it gives a yield of 1.1 kilograms. And a heavy tray plant, 3 to 4 crowns, planted in early Feb, it gave a yield of 1.14 kilograms. we have two completely different cropping profiles. The heavy tray plant gave a big spring yield from autumn-initiated trusses of nearly 700 grams of plant, and that yield came at 13,000, 27,000 GD8. And then there was a gap of about 10,000 GD8, and the reason for that is the suppressed growth of the spring-initiated flowers due to the plant load. And then looking at the small tray plants, it gave a lower spring yield, less than 400 grams a plant, but little or no gap between the first and second flush. And half of it started at 16,000 GD8 and the first flush finished at 27. And the second flush came in pretty much straight in behind at 27,000 GDH through to 63,000. They gave a similar yield. So it's really a case of matching the plant type to your sales windows. So adjusting everbearer cropping profile by truss pruning. Sorry, did I miss a slide? No. So adjusting everbearer cropping profile by truss pruning. This was done in Belgium on Murano cold stored mini trays, 135 cc. These were planted in March, in the middle of March, 6 plants per linear meter, and truss pruning was carried out on the 9th of July. And the idea was to reduce or remove the late summer flush because of poor prices, oversupply, and push more yield into the autumn. So 3 different treatments. So no truss pruning gave a yield of 7.6 kilograms per square meter, but a high mid-July production when there was market oversupply. 50% truss removal gave a slight reduction in yield, but less production in mid-July and August, and more production in September when prices are higher. All the trusses removed gave the biggest reduction in yield, with little or no production during mid-July to August, and the highest September yield. What we feel is the best from this is the 50 to 60% truss removal, a little bit earlier than it was done in this trial in late June or early July in Europe. In this trial, it was a little bit late. And the aim is to leave 2 trusses in production, 2 with flower or green fruit, and 2 trusses pre-flower. Some growers have tried a complete mow down instead of truss pruning, but this can give a big flush of small fruit in the autumn. One way to avoid that is to continue to remove newly emerging flowers until you've got a big enough leaf area. But the managed pruning seems to give the best result. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I hope nobody's fallen asleep out there and that I've given you some food for thought.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was an immense amount of value. I felt like I was drinking out of a fire hydrant. I'm not sure how I'm not sure how everyone else felt, but that was an immense amount of value. We are running a little bit over time, unfortunately, so
yes, sure.
We don't have time for questions, but I'm sure we can share some contact details for you, Nick, if anyone wants to follow up you separately. Can I get another round of applause for Nick?
It was my pleasure. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. That reminds me of a community service announcement Rachel asked me to make.